In the winter of 1967, inside the opulent walls of Graceland, a young woman stared at a small plastic test, her hands trembling as she realized her entire world was about to change forever. What happened next would shock even those closest to the king of rock and roll himself. It's December 1967, and 22-year-old Priscilla Presley sits alone in the master bedroom of the most famous house in Memphis. The room is decorated in Elvis's signature style, deep blues and golds, heavy curtains that block out the world, and mirrors that reflect a life lived under constant scrutiny. But right now, none of that luxury matters. In her hands is a small white stick that's just turned her world upside down. Priscilla had been living at Graceland for years now, ever since Elvis brought her from Germany when she was just a teenager. To the outside world, she was living a fairy tale, the beautiful girl who captured the heart of the king. But fairy tales don't tell you about the loneliness that comes with being trapped in a golden cage. Every day felt the same. Wake up when Elvis woke up, eat when he wanted to eat, sleep when he was ready to sleep. Her entire existence revolved around his schedule, his moods, his needs. The house was always full of people, the Memphis Mafia, as they called themselves, Elvis's loyal group of friends and bodyguards who followed him everywhere. Colonel Parker, his manager, was constantly scheming about the next career move. Staff members bustled around, keeping the mansion running. But despite all these people, Priscilla felt more alone than ever. She was Elvis's girl, and that's all she was allowed to be. And Elvis, he was consumed by his career like never before. The comeback special was in the works, his chance to prove he was still the king after years of mediocre movies. He spent hours at the studio, perfecting every note, every move. When he came home, he was either wired from the excitement or completely drained. Their conversations had become surface-level, routine. She could see him slipping away into his own world of music and ambition. But lately, something had been different. Her body was changing in ways she couldn't ignore. The morning sickness that hit her like a wave, the exhaustion that seemed to come from nowhere, the way certain smells made her stomach turn. She'd been telling herself it was stress, maybe the flu, anything but what she suspected deep down. Until now, until this moment, sitting on the edge of their bed, holding proof that everything was about to change. The test was positive. She was pregnant, and she had absolutely no idea how to tell the man she loved, the man who controlled every aspect of her life, that she was carrying his child. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of Graceland voices in the hallway, music drifting up from downstairs, the normal chaos of their daily life. But in here, in this moment, it was just her and this life-changing secret. She looked at herself in the mirror across the room and whispered the words that would haunt her for days to come. How do I tell him? The next few days passed, like a blur of anxiety and careful acting. Priscilla found herself studying Elvis's face constantly, trying to read his moods, searching for the perfect moment that never seemed to come. How do you tell someone that your lives are about to change forever? How do you find the right words when you're not even sure what his reaction will be? She'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying their entire relationship in her mind. She was just 14 when they first met in Germany, where her stepfather was stationed with the army. Elvis was 24, already a global superstar, but somehow still that charming Southern boy who made her feel like the most important person in the world. He'd promised her parents he'd take care of her, that she'd be safe with him. But what did safe mean when you were living in someone else's shadow? The power dynamic had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of their love story. Elvis made the decisions, where they went, what they did, even what she wore. He'd molded her into his perfect woman, and she'd let him because she loved him. But now, carrying his child, she was starting to realize she'd lost herself somewhere along the way. Would a baby make that better or worse? Would it give her purpose, or would it just be another chain binding her to a life she wasn't sure she wanted? The fear was eating her alive. What if he wasn't ready? What if he saw this as a burden, something that would interfere with his career? The '68 comeback special was everything to him right now, his chance to prove he was still relevant, still the king. A baby would change everything. There would be responsibilities, schedules to consider, a family to think about. Was he ready for that kind of commitment? But there was another fear, one that scared her even more. What if he was happy about it? What if this pregnancy became just another way for him to control her, to keep her exactly where he wanted her? The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect accessory to his perfect life. She'd never have a chance to figure out who she was outside of being Elvis's girl. The morning sickness was getting harder to hide. She'd excuse herself from breakfast, claiming she wasn't feeling well, or rush to the bathroom when certain smells became too overwhelming. Elvis was starting to notice. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the concern in his eyes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. He'd ask if she was okay, and she'd brush it off with a smile and a quick change of subject. The Memphis Mafia were around constantly, making private conversations nearly impossible. Colonel Parker was in and out of the house, discussing business deals and tour dates. The staff was always bustling around, cleaning, cooking, managing the daily operations of Graceland. There was never a moment when they were truly alone, never a quiet space where she could find the courage to speak the words that were burning inside her. She tried to imagine the conversation 100 different ways. Sometimes she pictured him being overjoyed, sweeping her up in his arms, talking about their future as a family. Other times she imagined anger, disappointment, accusations that this wasn't the right time. But the truth was, she had no idea how he'd react. Despite living together for years, despite loving each other deeply, there were still parts of Elvis that remained a mystery to her. The tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Elvis was stressed about the comeback special, snapping at the guys more than usual, staying up all night working on music. Priscilla was walking on eggshells, trying to appear normal while her entire world was shifting beneath her feet. They were living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, but they felt miles apart. Finally, one evening in mid-December, Elvis cornered her in their bedroom. He'd been watching her all day, and she could see the worry and frustration building in his eyes. "Scylla, what's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp with concern. "You've been acting strange for days. Are you sick? Are you unhappy? Talk to me." The walls were closing in, and Priscilla realized she couldn't keep this secret any longer. It was a cold December evening in 1967, and the air inside Graceland felt heavy with unspoken words. Elvis had just returned from a long day at American Sound Studio, his hair still perfectly styled, but his eyes tired from hours of recording. The house was quieter than usual, the Memphis Mafia had gone home for the night, and even the staff had retreated to their quarters. It was just Elvis and Priscilla, alone in their private world upstairs. Priscilla had been preparing for this moment all day. She'd rehearsed the words in her head, practiced different ways to break the news, but now that the time had come, her mind went completely blank. Her hands were shaking as she sat on the edge of their bed, watching Elvis move around the room with that restless energy he always had after a recording session. "Good session today," she managed to say, her voice sounding strangely small in the large room. Elvis glanced over at her, and she could see him studying her face. He knew something was wrong. He'd always been able to read her like a book, even when she tried to hide things from him. "Yeah, it was all right," he replied, but his attention was clearly on her now. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully. "But that's not what's important right now, is it? Scylla, you've been acting strange for days. I can see it in your eyes. You're scared about something. What's going on?" The concern in his voice almost broke her resolve. This was Elvis at his most vulnerable, when the walls came down and he was just a man worried about the woman he loved. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the famous face to the boy from Tupelo who'd lost his twin brother, who'd grown up poor and was still sometimes surprised by his success. "Elvis, she started, then stopped. "How do you change someone's entire life with just a few words? How do you tell someone that everything they think they know about their future is about to be completely different?" He moved closer, sitting down beside her on the bed. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. We're in this together, remember, always have been." His hand found hers, and she could feel the warmth of his touch, the calluses on his fingers from years of playing guitar. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for just a moment, and then looked directly into his blue eyes. "Elvis, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that couldn't be crossed. For a moment, Elvis just stared at her, his expression completely blank. She could see him processing what she'd said, the information slowly sinking in. His hand went still in hers. "What did you say?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I'm having a baby, we're having a baby." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Elvis's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been fear. He let go of her hand and stood up, running his fingers through his hair, a gesture she'd seen him make 1,000 times when he was trying to process something overwhelming. Are you sure?" he asked, his back still turned to her. "I took a test, I'm sure." He turned around slowly, and what she saw in his face wasn't what she expected. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It wasn't even joy. It was something much more complex, a mixture of vulnerability and terror that she'd never seen before. The king of rock and roll, the man who commanded stages and crowds, looked like a scared little boy. "Oh God," he whispered, and then something unexpected happened. Elvis Presley, the man who never showed weakness, the performer who was always in control, broke down completely. His composure cracked, and suddenly he was crying, not the quiet tears of a man trying to maintain his dignity, but the raw, uncontrolled sobs of someone whose deepest fears had just been awakened. "I don't know how to be a father," he said through his tears. "I don't know how to do this. What if I mess it up? What if I'm terrible at it? What if I end up like—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Priscilla knew what he meant. What if he ended up like his own father, Vernon, who had struggled with responsibility and had never quite lived up to Elvis's expectations? In that moment, everything changed. The invulnerable king of rock and roll showed his most human side, and Priscilla realized that beneath all the fame and success, Elvis was just as scared and uncertain as she was. What happened next would stay with Priscilla for the rest of her life. As Elvis broke down in front of her, something shifted in the room. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship for so long suddenly flipped, and for the first time, Priscilla found herself being the strong one. She stood up and went to him, wrapping her arms around the man who had always been her protector and now needed protecting himself. "It's okay," she whispered, running her hands through his hair the way he'd done for her so many times before. "We'll figure this out together." But Elvis was deep in his own emotional storm. Years of buried fears and insecurities came pouring out. "You don't understand," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "My daddy, he was never really there, you know, always chasing some get-rich-quick scheme, always disappointing people. I swore I'd never be like him, but what if I am? What if I don't know how to be a real father?" Priscilla held him tighter, feeling the weight of his vulnerability. This was a side of Elvis that the world never saw, not the confident performer, not the charismatic star, but a man haunted by his own childhood wounds. She thought about all the times she'd seen him with his mother Gladys, how devoted he'd been to her, how her death had nearly destroyed him. Family meant everything to Elvis, but it also terrified him. "Tell me about your father," she said softly, and gradually the story came out. Vernon Presley had been a complicated man, loving but irresponsible, present but unreliable. He'd been in and out of work, in and out of trouble, and young Elvis had often felt like he was the one taking care of his parents instead of the other way around. The fear of repeating that pattern had been eating at Elvis for years. "I travel so much," Elvis continued, his voice steadier now but still shaky. "I'm gone for weeks at a time. How can I be a father when I'm never home? How can I teach a child anything when I'm always on the road or in the studio? The kid will grow up thinking I don't care, just like I sometimes thought about my own daddy." Priscilla pulled back to look at him, really look at him. His face was red and puffy from crying, his famous hair disheveled, his carefully maintained image completely gone. But somehow, he looked more beautiful to her in that moment than he ever had on stage. This was the real Elvis, vulnerable, scared human. "But you do care," she said firmly. "That's the difference. You're already worried about being a good father, which means you will be. Your father might not have been perfect, but look what you became. You turned out pretty amazing." Something in Elvis's expression began to change. The panic was still there, but underneath it, she could see something else growing, a tentative kind of hope. He reached out and placed his hand gently on her stomach, even though there was nothing to feel yet. "There's really a baby in there?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "There really is." For a long moment, they just sat there in the quiet of their bedroom, his hand on her stomach, both of them trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. Then Elvis did something that surprised her even more than his breakdown had. He got down on his knees in front of her, his hand still on her stomach, and looked up at her with tears still glistening in his eyes. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm more scared than I've ever been in my life. But I want this, Scylla. I want this baby, and I want to be better than I think I can be. I want to be the father this child deserves." In that moment, Priscilla saw the transformation beginning. The man who had always been concerned primarily with his career, his image, his own needs, was starting to think about someone else first. The pregnancy wasn't just changing her body, it was changing Elvis's heart. "We'll do this together," she said, helping him to his feet. "We'll figure out how to be parents together, and Elvis, you're going to be an amazing father, I know it." As they held each other in the quiet of their bedroom, both of them still processing the enormity of what was happening, Elvis whispered something that would define their future. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be better than I ever thought I could be." The news of Priscilla's pregnancy didn't just change Elvis and Priscilla, it sent shockwaves through the entire Graceland ecosystem. Within days, the whole dynamic of the house had shifted. Elvis, who had always been the center of attention, suddenly had someone else to focus on. Every decision, every plan, every conversation now had to take into account the baby that was coming. The Memphis Mafia noticed the change immediately. Red West, Sonny West, Joe Esposito, the guys who had been with Elvis through everything, suddenly found themselves dealing with a different version of their friend. The all-night parties became less frequent. The spontaneous road trips and impulsive adventures were put on hold. Elvis was still Elvis, but now he was Elvis with a mission, preparing to be a father. "We need to get married," Elvis announced to Priscilla one morning, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. They'd been talking about marriage for years, but it had always been someday, eventually, when the time was right. Now, with a baby on the way, the time was suddenly very right. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, was less than thrilled about the timing. He'd been planning the comeback special for months, and now suddenly his star was talking about taking time off for a wedding and a baby. "This could hurt your image," the colonel warned during one of their meetings. "You're supposed to be the available bachelor, the heartthrob. A wife and baby might change how the fans see you." But Elvis was unmoved. "Then they'll have to see me differently," he said, with a firmness that surprised everyone. "I'm not going to hide my family for the sake of my career. This is more important than any of that." The transformation in Elvis was remarkable to witness. The man who had always been somewhat selfish, who had structured his entire life around his own needs and desires, was suddenly thinking about someone else first. He started researching pregnancy, reading books about fatherhood, asking questions that showed how seriously he was taking this new role. He became incredibly protective of Priscilla, where before he'd been controlling, now he was caring. He made sure she was eating properly, getting enough rest, taking her vitamins. He cut back on his recording sessions so he could be home with her more. The guys joked that Elvis was more nervous about the pregnancy than Priscilla was. "I want to do this right," he told Red West one evening. "I want to be the kind of father I always wished I had. This baby is going to know that it's loved, that it's wanted, that it's the most important thing in the world to me." The wedding planning began almost immediately. Elvis wanted something small and intimate, a far cry from the elaborate spectacle everyone expected. "I don't want a circus," he said. "I want it to be about us, about our family." They decided on Las Vegas, a quick ceremony with just their closest friends and family. But even as they planned for the future, there were challenges. Elvis's schedule was still demanding, and the pressure of the comeback special was intense. He was trying to balance his career with his new priorities, and it wasn't always easy. There were moments when the old Elvis would surface, impatient, demanding, focused solely on his own needs. Priscilla, meanwhile, was dealing with her own transformation. The pregnancy was making her sick, tired, and emotional. But more than that, she was starting to see a different future for herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't just Elvis's girlfriend, she was going to be someone's mother. It was a role that belonged entirely to her, something that couldn't be controlled or managed by anyone else. "I'm scared too," she confided to Elvis one night as they lay in bed. What if I don't know how to be a mother? What if I'm not good at it? Elvis pulled her closer. You're going to be amazing, he said. I've seen how you are with people, how caring you are. This baby is lucky to have you as its mother. As the weeks passed, the pregnancy became more real to both of them. They started talking about names, about nursery decorations, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. Elvis would put his hand on Priscilla's growing belly and talk to the baby, telling it about the world it was going to enter, making promises about the love and protection it would receive. We are really doing this, Priscilla said one evening, watching Elvis as he read a book about infant care. We are really doing this, he agreed, looking up at her with a smile that was both nervous and excited. And we're going to be great at it. May 1, 1967, arrived with all the nervous energy of a couple taking the biggest leap of their lives. The Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas wasn't the most romantic setting for a wedding, but for Elvis and Priscilla, it was perfect. Small, intimate, and private, exactly what they wanted as they prepared to become not just husband and wife, but parents. Elvis stood at the altar in his black tuxedo, his hands shaking slightly as he waited for Priscilla to walk down the aisle. When she appeared in her simple white dress, her small bump just beginning to show, he broke into a smile that lit up the entire room. This wasn't the Elvis Presley the world knew. This was a man about to marry the woman he loved and start the family he'd always dreamed of. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When Elvis said, "I do," he wasn't just promising to be Priscilla's husband, he was promising to be the father their child deserved. When they kissed, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Elvis threw himself into getting ready for fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to his music. He read every parenting book he could find, asked endless questions of friends who had children, and spent hours planning the nursery at Graceland. What if it's a boy? He'd ask Priscilla. What if it's a girl? What kind of room should we make? What kind of toys should we get? His excitement was infectious, and Priscilla found herself falling in love with this new version of the man she'd always loved. But it was the quiet moments that really showed how much Elvis had changed. He would sit with Priscilla in the evenings, his hand on her growing belly, talking to their unborn child. "Hey there, little one," he'd whisper. "It's your daddy. I can't wait to meet you. I'm going to love you so much, and I'm going to be the best father I can be." As Priscilla's due date approached, Elvis became more and more anxious. He wanted everything to be perfect. He made sure the hospital had the best doctors, the best room, the best of everything. He barely slept during the last few weeks, too excited and nervous to rest. Then on February 1, 1968, at 5:01 p.m., Lisa Marie Presley entered the world. Elvis was packing the waiting room when the doctor came out to tell him he had a daughter. The king of rock and roll, the man who had performed in front of millions of people, was suddenly speechless. When they brought him into the room to meet his daughter, Elvis broke down completely. He held Lisa Marie for the first time, this tiny, perfect little person who was half him and half Priscilla, and the tears flowed freely. "She's so beautiful," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "She's perfect. Look at her little hands, her little face." Priscilla watched from the hospital bed as Elvis held their daughter, and she saw the final piece of his transformation fall into place. This wasn't just Elvis being emotional. This was Elvis becoming a father. The man who had always been the center of his own universe suddenly had a new center, and it was this tiny baby girl. "Hello, Lisa Marie," he said softly, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm your daddy. I love you so much already. I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to be the best daddy I can be. I promise you that." In that moment, looking at Elvis holding their daughter, Priscilla knew that everything had changed. The man who had once been afraid of fatherhood was now completely transformed by it. The baby that had started as a secret, a source of fear and uncertainty, had become the greatest joy of their lives. "Thank you," Elvis said to Priscilla, his eyes still on Lisa Marie. "Thank you for giving me the family I never knew I needed. Thank you for making me a father." As the three of them sat together in that hospital room, Elvis, Priscilla, and baby Lisa Marie, they weren't just a couple anymore. They were a family, and for that moment, at least, everything was perfect. What happened that December evening in 1967, when Priscilla told Elvis she was pregnant, was more than just a couple sharing life-changing news. It was a moment that revealed something profound about love, vulnerability, and the power of unexpected news to transform our lives in ways we never imagined. Elvis's reaction, his breakdown, his fear, his ultimate transformation showed us that even the most confident, successful people among us are still human beings with deep fears and insecurities. The king of rock and roll was afraid of being a father, afraid of repeating his own father's mistakes, afraid of not being good enough for the child he didn't even know was coming. But in that vulnerability, he found strength. In that fear, he found purpose. The story of that night reminds us that the most important moments in our lives often come disguised as ordinary conversations. Priscilla had no idea when she sat down to tell Elvis her news that she was about to witness the complete transformation of the man she loved. She was just a scared young woman with a secret, trying to find the courage to share it. But that's how life works, isn't it? The moments that change everything rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They come quietly, in hospital rooms and bedrooms and kitchens, when we're least prepared for them. They come in the form of pregnancy tests and phone calls and conversations that start with, "I have something to tell you." Elvis and Priscilla's story also teaches us about the power of showing up for each other in our most vulnerable moments. When Elvis broke down that night, Priscilla could have been hurt that his reaction wasn't immediately joyful. Instead, she saw past his fear to the man underneath, and she chose to be strong for him when he couldn't be strong for himself. The legacy of that night lived on in Lisa Marie, who became the center of Elvis's world in a way that nothing else ever had. She was the bridge between his public and private selves, the one person who could make the king of rock and roll get down on the floor and play with toy cars. She was proof that love doesn't make us weaker, it makes us capable of being better than we ever thought we could be. In the end, the most stunning reaction that night wasn't Elvis's tears or his fear or even his transformation. It was the simple truth that love, real, vulnerable, transformative love, has the power to change us in ways we never expected. It can take a man who's afraid of being a father and turn him into someone who would move mountains for his child. It can take a woman who's lost herself in someone else's shadow and give her a new identity as a mother. That December evening in 1967, when Priscilla told Elvis she was pregnant, she didn't just share news about a baby. She gave him permission to become the man he was meant to be. She offered him the chance to be better than his fears, stronger than his insecurities, more loving than he ever thought possible. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. Sometimes, the most ordinary moments become the most extraordinary ones. Sometimes, the conversations we're most afraid to have are the ones that set us free. The next time you're sitting across from someone you love, holding news that will change both your lives, remember Elvis and Priscilla. Remember that vulnerability is not weakness, it's the birthplace of transformation. Remember that the most beautiful reactions often come wrapped in tears and fear and the courage to be completely honest about who we are and who we want to become. Because in the end, love isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to show up, be vulnerable, and choose each other again and again, especially when everything is about to change.